The Holy Gospel according to Luke. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come to lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus, in like manner, evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Be seated, please. You're in a series about the 6 marks of discipleship. And I can't think of a more important gospel passage for us to consider in thinking about what it means to be a disciple than this strange story that might sound a little scary and odd, but I think when Jesus spoke it was almost like a comedy routine. You know, a lot of comedy works on taking a person who's high and lifted up and seen as very important and kind of puncturing the bubble and bringing them down to earth. Have you ever noticed that about comedy? And that's what's happening in this story. And it reveals to us something very important about what it means to be a real disciple of Jesus Christ. One of the things that's striking about this story, if you look on the news from day to day, still in our time, it's the rich people whose names we know. But in this story, you never learn the name of the rich man. He's just an anonymous rich man. In this story, the one with a name is the poor man. And he's described in the saddest terms of poverty. Back in 2006 and 2007, I wrote a book about global crises. And part of the research for my book was I had the chance to travel to many countries around the world and visit the most impoverished slums and refugee camps and squatter settlements around the world. I had the opportunity to sleep in a few of those settlements, right? Sleep in the home of someone, the shack of someone who lived in a place where as you walk, you're walking among feces and urine, you're walking among starving dogs who haven't had anything to eat in weeks, and the people aren't much better off. It was a powerful experience of seeing what real poverty looks like. And that's the picture Jesus uses. Lazarus is sitting outside the gate of the rich man's house. He's hungry. He's wishing for just some garbage that he could eat. and he's covered in sores. We would say today he's lacking the most basic health care. And in fact, instead of doctors and nurses, he has dogs who are licking the sores of his body. It's intended by Jesus to be a disgusting, heartbreaking, almost extreme description of poverty. And in contrast, this rich man, he's got nice suits, and great sheets to sleep on, and he's eating caviar and steak, and he's the person everybody wishes they could be. He might even have a golden toilet, for all we know. That's the kind of guy this rich man is. A few years ago, there was a lot of talk, and I think it was important to talk about the 1% versus the 99%. And I was at a gathering once where we were talking about this, and I said, does anybody know what it takes to be in the 1%? And they said, well, globally, if you think around the whole world, it's different than if it's just in America. In America, to be in the 1%, if you make above about $350,000 a year, you're in the 1%. So maybe some of us here are in the 1%. Then they said, but globally, to be in the 1%, if you make $35,000 a year, you're in the global 1%. So I realized, wow, I'm in the 1%. Can I be honest? Globally, I'm a lot more like the rich guy than I am like Lazarus. And so then they die. I mean, when Jesus sets this up, it's almost like one of those old jokes, There are two guys walk into a bar. This time, it's two guys walk into the afterlife. And things aren't so good now for the rich man. Now, I should tell you, the Christian faith, we've done a lot of weird things through the centuries, and we've done some pretty horrible things with the subject of hell. What's interesting in this story, it's one of the clearest teachings about hell, and it's a teaching I've never heard taught in any church or in any book of theology anywhere. Here's the teaching. If you just want to read the Bible literally, here's the teaching. If you're rich, you go to hell, and if you're poor, you go to heaven. The word of the Lord. Really, that's Jesus. That if you just wanted to be very simplistic in reading this text, that's kind of what it's saying. I'll tell you what's interesting, though. Luke says that Jesus doesn't use the Hebrew word for the place of the dead, which, by the way, was not hell. That's another whole subject. Jesus uses the word Hades. So it's as if Jesus is saying to the people, listen, I'm going to borrow from Greek mythology. You might remember there was Hades and the river Styx, and that's the geography of this parable. I'm borrowing from Greek mythology here to tell you a story, to get a point across to you. Ironically, we Christians have had all kinds of clever ways of twisting this around to miss its actual point. Because its actual point is, to a lot of us, that we're like Lazarus, and that we're like the rich man, and we better wake up. The rich man says, I'm in agony, and he starts giving orders to Abraham. Have you ever noticed that some rich people just don't get it when they're in trouble? Have you ever noticed that some rich people still think they can give orders? And so here is this rich man saying, hey, Father Abraham, send Lazarus, as if Lazarus is still a slave of little worth who he can order around. And Abraham says, yeah, sorry, we can't help you, kid. Can't do that. There's a big gap between us. We might want to come help you, but we can't. You're you've made your bed, you better lie in it now. And then the rich man says, well, please send Lazarus to my brothers so that they won't end up in this trouble. Kind of interesting that part of the mentality of this rich man is that Lazarus still doesn't matter, only he and his family matters. It's kind of a mafia mindset even in Hades. Only my family matters. And so the story ends with him saying, well, maybe if Lazarus came from the dead, my brothers would believe. And here come these powerful words from Father Abraham. Listen, want to tell you something, buddy. If you didn't listen to Moses and the prophets while you were alive, you're not even going to listen if someone rises from the dead. Be an interesting sermon, interesting passage to preach on Easter morning, wouldn't it? If you don't listen to Moses and the prophets like Amos, who says, alas for those rich people who live on couches of ease. They've got their easy boy recliner, and they got life easy. And do you understand what Amos is saying? Those poor, pitiful, rich people, they don't understand that they've been blinded by their riches. You know, if you were a psychologist and you read this text, you'd say, this parable of Jesus is about confirmation bias. Maybe you've heard of this. It's a scary thing when you understand it. Confirmation bias says that we get ways of looking at the world. And then whenever new information comes, if it fits in, if it confirms our little box through which we see the world, if it fits in, we accept it. And if it doesn't fit in, it bounces off. Before we even can think about whether it's true or not, it bounces off. Our confirmation bias gets set. And anything that doesn't fit in, we call fake news. Anything that doesn't fit in, we call a misinformation. Or anything that doesn't fit in, we don't even see it or hear it. It's just outside the realm of possibility. And Jesus is giving us a kind of lesson in psychology here to say, listen, you can create a box of confirmation bias so that even if someone were to rise from the dead, you'd never hear the sense of it. Now, this is where, as a person who wants to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, I have to have some self-examination here. Because if I take this story and put it in context, here's what I find out. This is the fifth parable in a series of 5 parables that began in Luke chapter 15, and here's how it started. Jesus was having meals with tax collectors and sinners. Now, you could put your own list from today. Who are the people who'd be characterized as outsiders, outcasts, the unwanted? You know, you could say, who's Jesus hanging out with in today's context? People of the wrong race, the wrong legal status, the wrong immigration status, the wrong gender, the wrong politics, the wrong cable news channel, whatever it is. You could think of who the people you would say Jesus should not hang out with. He's hanging out with them, he's having a meal with them, and he actually seems to be enjoying their company. And so the Pharisees and the teachers of the law are all upset about this. They start to grumble, and Jesus tells a series of 5 parables. This is the 5th. First is the parable of the 99 sheep who are safe versus the one who's lost. Next is the parable of the woman who loses 1 out of her 10 coins. There's kind of a numbers thing going on here for all the engineers and accountants and all the rest of here. There's numbers going on here. 1 out of 99 sheep is lost. 1 out of 10 coins is lost. 1 out of 2 sons is lost. Although if you really read that story of the prodigal son, both sons are lost. They're just lost in different ways. And then he tells a story of a manager who switches sides. He stops working for the rich and starts working for the poor. And now comes this parable. And in between, Luke interrupts and he says, look, let me remind you and explain to you what's going on here. Those Pharisees who were criticizing Jesus for loving the wrong people, the thing they really love is money. And then Jesus says to them, listen, what you value highly is despicable to God. And in other places he says, and what God values is often despicable to human beings. And so what he's saying is, look, folks, if you want to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, if you want to be my disciple, you've got to be aware that confirmation bias has set in to make you value certain things greatly, to value things that don't have real value to God. and to discount things, to consider them worthless, unimportant, or despicable when they actually have great value to God. Now, if we really sincerely want to be disciples of Jesus Christ, we have to say that confirmation bias could have set in me as well. And if I want to be a disciple, I have to repent, rethink, deconstruct my confirmation bias and tear open that box and be open in some way to the good news of Jesus Christ, that God has a different value system, that the people who are being judged as outsiders and outcasts and unwanted and unloved, their love to God, God knows their name. And that when we who've been blinded by the love of money and blinded by economic systems and blinded by political systems to see things inside of a certain way, that Jesus wants to rip that box open and say, listen, see things afresh. You know, this week, millions of people around the world marched, inspired by a young girl from Sweden. And they marched to say, listen, right now everybody thinks what matters most is money. But we got to wake up and say, other things matter. The mountains matter. The oceans matter. The fish matter. The birds matter. The insects matter. It's not just money that matters. People matter. This beautiful world that God made matters. And we are all invited now to repent, rethink, deconstruct our confirmation bias, and open ourselves to a new value system, a value system that comes from God. Our lives depend on it. Our future depends on it. For me as a guy, I'm not rich, but I'm in the global 1%. I'm not in the American 1%, but I'm in the global 1%. For me as a guy, I have some money in the bank. I've got a retirement account. I have to ask myself, how have my eyes been blinded? How has my value system been distorted by money? And how can I learn to put money down at the bottom and move up things of true value? Compassion over cash. People over profit. The common good over self-interest. Lazarus over comfort. If I will learn to live by that new value system, I will find what it means to be a disciple, and I'll find true value indeed, and so will you. That's the good news for today. And all God's people say,
Amen.